The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air carried a slight chill, signaling the arrival of autumn. Birds chirped softly in the distance as Marcus Johnson walked along the quiet path through the park on his way to school. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, and he clutched a notebook filled with notes from last night's study session. A bright kid with big dreams, Marcus had always been proud of his grades. He wanted to become an engineer someday, someone who could build things that mattered. As he strolled past the empty benches and rustling trees, Marcus felt at ease. It was peaceful here, away from the noise of traffic and the crowded streets. This shortcut through the park saved him time every morning, giving him a few extra minutes to prepare for class. But today, something felt different. Out of nowhere, the sound of tires screeching against pavement broke the calm. Marcus turned his head just in time to see a police cruiser pull up beside him, its red and blue lights flashing ominously. Two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions stern. One of them approached Marcus while the other lingered near the vehicle, watching silently. "Hey, kid," the first officer barked, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school already?" Marcus froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. He quickly regained his composure and replied politely, "I'm going to school right now. I take this route every day." He pointed toward the trail that led directly to his school, visible in the distance. But the officer didn't seem satisfied. Instead, he narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "You sure about that? You don't look like you're in a hurry. What's your name?" Without hesitation, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his student ID card. He handed it over, hoping it would clear things up. The officer examined it closely, then glanced back at Marcus, clearly unconvinced. "This could be fake," he muttered under his breath. "How do we know you're not lying?" Marcus frowned, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "It's not fake," he said firmly but respectfully. "I'm just walking to school like I always do." The second officer chimed in now, his voice gruff. "We've had reports of kids skipping school around here lately. Maybe you're one of them." Marcus shook his head, trying to stay calm. "No, sir. I promise I'm telling the truth." But the more he tried to explain, the more skeptical they became. They started asking more questions, questions that made no sense to Marcus. Why would someone think he wasn't going to school? Why did they assume he was up to no good? As the minutes ticked by, Marcus noticed people passing by, glancing curiously at the scene unfolding before them. Some slowed down to watch, while others hurried away, avoiding eye contact. No one stepped forward to help. Marcus felt increasingly isolated, standing there alone with two authority figures who seemed determined to find fault where none existed. The officers grew more impatient, their voices rising slightly. One of them gestured toward Marcus's backpack. "Open it," he demanded abruptly. "Let's see what you've got in there." Marcus hesitated for a split second, unsure why they were treating him this way. Slowly, he unzipped the bag and showed them its contents: textbooks, notebooks, pens, and a calculator. Nothing unusual. Yet the suspicion in the officer's eyes didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. By now, Marcus's heart was pounding. He couldn't understand why this was happening. All he'd done was walk to school like any other day. But instead of being left alone, he found himself trapped in a situation that felt unfair and completely out of his control. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Marcus stood frozen, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack as the officers continued to scrutinize him. One of them leaned closer, his voice sharp and accusing. "You sure this is all you've got? No stolen goods? No reason we should be suspicious?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but their relentless questioning was making him feel smaller by the moment. "I told you already," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I'm just going to school. I don't have anything illegal. But the officers weren't satisfied. They exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them reached out suddenly, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Let's see your pockets," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Startled, Marcus stumbled slightly, dropping his books onto the ground. Papers scattered across the pavement, fluttering like leaves in the wind. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Marcus stared at his belongings strewn on the ground, disbelief washing over him. This wasn't how mornings were supposed to go. He bent down instinctively to pick up his things, but the officer tightened his grip on his arm. "Don't move," the man snapped. "Not until we're done here." Tears pricked at the corners of Marcus's eyes, though he blinked them back fiercely. He hated feeling so powerless, so misunderstood. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, he could say to make them see that he was just a kid trying to get to class. But the words caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there, his heart pounding, as the officers rifled through his pockets and inspected his notebook. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some people lingered at a distance, watching silently, while others whispered among themselves. A woman walking her dog paused briefly, shaking her head before moving on. An older man sat on a nearby bench, observing the scene with a furrowed brow. No one stepped forward to intervene or ask what was happening. It was as if an invisible wall separated Marcus from the rest of the world, isolating him even further. The officer's questions became more pointed, almost mocking. "What's a kid like you doing carrying around all these fancy notebooks anyway?" One of them sneered. "You some kind of genius or something." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to speak without his voice trembling. Instead, he focused on keeping his breathing steady, trying not to let his emotions overwhelm him. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Each second felt like an eternity as the officers continued their interrogation. Finally, one of them pulled out a phone. "All right, kid," he said gruffly. "We're calling your parents. Let's see what they have to say about this." Relief flickered briefly in Marcus's chest. If they called his dad, surely this nightmare would end. His father always knew how to handle tough situations. But as the officer dialed the number listed on Marcus's ID, a new wave of anxiety washed over him. What if they didn't believe his dad either? What if this only made things worse? The phone rang twice before someone answered. The officer barked into the receiver, explaining the situation in clipped, dismissive tones. Marcus watched nervously, his gaze darting between the officer and the growing crowd. For a split second, he allowed himself to imagine his father arriving, calm, commanding, and ready to set things straight. But deep down, fear still gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change something, whether he wanted it to or not. As the officer listened to the response on the other end of the line, his expression shifted ever so slightly. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the armor of authority he'd worn so confidently just moments ago. Whatever was being said on the phone, it was clear that things were about to take a turn, and Marcus wasn't sure whether to feel hopeful or terrified. The officer held the phone to his ear, his brow furrowing as he listened intently to the voice on the other end. At first, his tone was brusque and authoritative, the same one he'd used with Marcus. But within seconds, something changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly, and his grip on the phone tightened. The deep, commanding voice on the line wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't angry or defensive. It was calm, measured, and carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "This is Commander Elijah Johnson," the voice said firmly. "I understand you're speaking with my son, Marcus. Can you explain why he's being detained?" The officer hesitated, caught off guard by the title and the quiet confidence behind it. He glanced at Marcus, then back at his partner, who raised an eyebrow in silent curiosity. Clearing his throat, the officer stammered, "Why, yes, sir. We were just conducting a routine check. Your son was walking through the park, and we needed to verify his identity." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, but when Commander Johnson spoke again, his tone had shifted, just enough to make the officer uneasy. A routine check. He repeated, his words deliberate and sharp. My son is 14 years old, walking to school. Are you telling me that a child heading to class warrants a routine check? Or is there something else going on here? The officer's face flushed red, though he tried to mask it by adjusting his hat. He glanced at Marcus again, suddenly aware of how young and harmless the boy looked. Still, he pressed on, attempting to justify their actions. Sir, we've had reports of kids skipping school in this area. We're just doing our job. Commander Johnson's response came swiftly, cutting through the officer's weak explanation like a knife. Your job is to protect and serve, not harass children who are simply trying to get an education. I'll be there shortly to discuss this matter further. In the meantime, I suggest you treat my son with the respect he deserves. The call ended abruptly, leaving the officer standing there, phone still in hand, looking more flustered than before. He turned to his partner, lowering his voice. That was, his dad, Navy SEAL commander or something. He's coming here. The second officer's eyes widened. Navy SEAL? You're kidding. Nope, the first officer muttered, running a hand over his face. This just got complicated. As the officers exchanged nervous glances, Marcus stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt a flicker of hope. His father's voice alone had been enough to shake these men. And now he was on his way. But even as relief washed over him, Marcus couldn't ignore the lingering frustration bubbling inside. Why had it taken his father's rank and reputation to make them reconsider their behavior? Would they have treated him differently if he hadn't mentioned his dad? Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The crowd that had gathered earlier began to disperse, sensing that the situation was about to escalate beyond their understanding. A few people lingered, whispering among themselves, while others shook their heads and walked away. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the road, waiting for the familiar sight of his father's black SUV. When it finally appeared, turning sharply into the parking lot, Marcus felt a surge of pride and relief. The vehicle screeched to a halt near the scene, and out stepped Elijah Johnson. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an aura of quiet strength, he commanded attention without saying a word. Dressed in civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, he didn't need a uniform to convey authority. Every step he took radiated purpose. Elijah approached the group, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. When his gaze landed on Marcus, his expression softened momentarily. He gave his son a small nod, silently letting him know everything would be okay. Then, turning to the officers, he introduced himself formally. Commander Elijah Johnson, he said, his voice steady and clear. I believe you've met my son. The officers straightened instinctively, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. One of them stuttered an apology, trying to explain their actions, but Elijah raised a hand to silence them. We'll talk about this properly, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But first, I want to hear exactly what happened from Marcus. For the first time that morning, Marcus felt truly seen. His father's presence wasn't just intimidating, it was protective, a shield against the unfairness he'd faced. As he began recounting the events, his voice grew stronger, steadier. With every word, the officers seemed to shrink a little more, realizing too late that they had underestimated both the boy and his family. Elijah Johnson stood tall, his presence commanding attention without effort. The officers shifted uncomfortably under his piercing gaze, their earlier confidence now replaced by visible unease. One of them tried to speak again, stumbling over an apology. Sir, we were just following protocol. We didn't mean any harm. Elijah cut him off with a single raised hand, his expression unreadable but undeniably intense. Protocol. He repeated, his voice low and steady, yet laced with quiet authority. Let's talk about your so-called protocol. He took a step closer, his height and demeanor making the officers instinctively take a half step back. First, Elijah continued, his tone calm but firm. You stopped my son, a child, for no valid reason. Second, you questioned his identity despite clear evidence that he is who he says he is. Third, you escalated the situation unnecessarily, treating him as if he were a suspect rather than a student on his way to school. And now here we are. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. They had expected an angry father, someone shouting or demanding answers in frustration. But Elijah wasn't shouting. His composure was far more intimidating. Every word he spoke carried the weight of experience. Years spent leading teams in high-stakes situations where mistakes could cost lives. These officers weren't dealing with an ordinary parent. They were facing someone trained to assess, analyze, and hold people accountable. Marcus watched silently, marveling at his father's ability to remain composed even in moments like this. He'd always admired Elijah's strength, but today it felt different. It wasn't just physical power or rank. It was the way he carried himself, the way he made others listen without raising his voice. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt safe. Elijah turned his attention briefly to Marcus, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice filled with genuine concern. Marcus nodded, though his eyes betrayed lingering frustration. Elijah gave his son's shoulder a gentle squeeze before turning back to the officers. I want answers, Elijah said, his tone sharpening slightly. Why did you stop him? What specific behavior led you to believe he was suspicious? Was it because he's black? The question hung in the air, heavy and unignorable. The officers froze, caught off guard by the directness of it. One of them opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find the right words. It wasn't like that, sir, the second officer finally managed to say, though his voice lacked conviction. We've had issues with truancy in this area lately. We're just trying to keep the community safe. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying them with an intensity that made them squirm. Safe for whom? He asked pointedly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you targeted my son based on assumptions, not facts. That's not keeping anyone safe. That's profiling. The accusation struck a nerve. Both officers looked down, avoiding eye contact. They knew Elijah was right, but admitting it would only make things worse. Instead, they remained silent, their discomfort palpable. Elijah let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. Here's what's going to happen next, he said, his voice firm and decisive. You will release Marcus immediately. You will apologize to him, not to me, but to him, for the way you've treated him today. And then, we're going to have a conversation about accountability. Because this isn't just about my son. This is about how you interact with everyone in this community. The officers nodded quickly, eager to comply. One of them turned to Marcus, offering a mumbled apology. Sorry, kid. We didn't mean to cause any trouble. Marcus met his gaze steadily, though he didn't respond. He appreciated the apology, but it didn't erase what had happened. Elijah noticed his son's hesitation and stepped in once more. Apologies are a start, he said, addressing the officers. But actions matter more. I'll be following up with your department to ensure this doesn't happen again, to Marcus or anyone else. With that, Elijah gestured for Marcus to gather his belongings. As Marcus picked up his scattered books and papers, Elijah kept a watchful eye on the officers, ensuring they didn't try to interfere further. Once everything was packed, Elijah placed a protective arm around Marcus's shoulders and guided him toward the SUV. As they walked away, the crowd that had lingered nearby began to clap softly. Some cheered quietly, while others simply nodded in approval. Elijah acknowledged them with a brief nod of gratitude, but his focus remained on Marcus. You handled yourself well today, he said as they reached the car. I'm proud of you. The ride home was quiet but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Marcus stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past as his father drove. Elijah's hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, his jaw set in a way that told Marcus he was still processing everything that had happened. Though Elijah hadn't said much since they left the park, Marcus could feel the storm brewing beneath his father's calm exterior. He knew Elijah wasn't just upset about what had happened to him. It was bigger than that. When they arrived home, Lisa Johnson, Marcus's mother, was waiting at the door. A pediatrician known for her kindness and patience, she had already received a brief call from Elijah while he was on his way to the park. Her warm smile faded the moment she saw the look on her husband's face and the tension in her son's posture. Without a word, she ushered them inside, closing the door behind them. "Tell me everything," Lisa said softly, sitting down at the kitchen table with Marcus and Elijah. Her voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it, a protective edge that only came out when her family needed her most. Marcus recounted the events of the morning, his words halting at first, but growing steadier as he spoke. Lisa listened intently, her hands clasped tightly together. When he finished, she reached across the table to take his hand, her eyes filled with both anger and sorrow. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No child should ever feel the way you must have felt today." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about one bad day," he said, breaking the silence. "It's about patterns that need to be broken. What happened to Marcus isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, and we can't let it slide." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding where Elijah was headed. "What do you plan to do?" she asked, glancing between her husband and son. "I'm going to meet with the police chief tomorrow," Elijah replied, his tone resolute. "And I won't stop there. This needs to be addressed, not just for Marcus, but for every kid who might find themselves in a similar situation. If we don't push for change now, nothing will improve." Lisa hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "Elijah, I know you want justice, but we also have to think about our family. Making waves like this, it could bring unwanted attention. Are you ready for that?" Elijah met her gaze steadily. "I'm not doing this alone," he said. "We're in this together, as a family. And yes, there might be challenges ahead. But if we stay silent, we're telling Marcus that his voice doesn't matter. That he doesn't matter. I refuse to let him believe that." Marcus, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Dad's right," he said softly, surprising even himself. "If we don't say something, who will? I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did today." Lisa looked at her son, pride swelling in her chest despite her worries. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "All right," she said, her voice firm now. "Then we'll figure this out together. But we need to be smart about it. We'll reach out to people who can help. Lawyers, community leaders, anyone who can support us." Elijah nodded approvingly. "Good idea. I've already started making calls. There are organizations that specialize in cases like this. They'll guide us on how to proceed." As the conversation continued, the Johnsons began mapping out their next steps. Elijah emphasized the importance of documenting everything: the officers' behavior, their words, and any evidence they could gather. Lisa suggested reaching out to local activists and advocacy groups, knowing they could amplify their message and provide additional resources. Marcus, though still processing his emotions, offered to write about his experience, hoping it might inspire others to speak up. By the time dinner was served, the mood in the house had shifted slightly. The weight of the day's events still lingered, but there was also a sense of purpose. The Johnsons weren't just victims of injustice, they were becoming advocates for change. As they sat around the table sharing a meal, Elijah raised his glass. "To standing up for what's right," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "To standing up," Lisa echoed, raising her own glass. Marcus hesitated for a moment before joining in. "To making things better," he added quietly, a small but determined smile forming on his lips. For the first time that day, the future didn't seem quite so daunting. With his parents by his side, Marcus realized that while the road ahead might be challenging, they would face it together. And that made all the difference. The next morning, news of the incident spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By the time Elijah arrived at the police station for his meeting with the chief, whispers about the Navy SEAL commander and his son were already circulating. Some people praised Elijah's courage in standing up to the officers, while others expressed skepticism, questioning whether he was overreacting. Social media buzzed with posts, photos, and opinions, turning a personal family matter into a public conversation. At school, Marcus felt the ripple effects almost immediately. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed classmates glancing at him curiously. A few kids approached him during lunch, asking if the rumors were true. "Is your dad really a Navy SEAL?" one boy asked, wide-eyed. Others whispered behind his back, their voices hushed but unmistakable. Teachers seemed to treat him differently too. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others watched him more closely, as if expecting him to act out or cause trouble. Marcus tried to focus on his studies, but it was hard to ignore the attention. He wasn't used to being the center of gossip, and it made him feel uneasy. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be labeled, to have people make assumptions about you based on something outside your control. It was frustrating, exhausting even, but he reminded himself why his family was doing this. If telling his story could help someone else avoid the same pain, then maybe it was worth it. Meanwhile, Elijah's meeting with the police chief proved to be intense. The chief, a seasoned officer named Robert Hayes, greeted Elijah with a mix of respect and caution. He had clearly heard about the situation and knew Elijah wasn't someone to take lightly. After exchanging formal introductions, they sat down in the chief's office, a room filled with plaques, awards, and framed photos of Hayes shaking hands with local officials. "I want to start by apologizing for what happened," Hayes began, leaning forward slightly. "Those officers acted improperly, and we're investigating the matter thoroughly." Elijah nodded but didn't soften his stance. "An apology is a start," he said evenly. "But actions speak louder than words. I'm here because I want to see real change, not just for my son, but for everyone affected by bias in law enforcement." Hayes listened carefully, nodding along as Elijah outlined his concerns. He explained how systemic issues like racial profiling and lack of accountability undermine trust between the community and the police. He shared examples from his own experiences, both as a military leader and as a black man raising a family in America. His words were measured but powerful, leaving no room for deflection or excuses. By the end of the meeting, Hayes agreed to implement several changes within the department. These included mandatory training sessions on implicit bias, improved protocols for interacting with minors, and increased transparency when complaints were filed. While Elijah appreciated the commitments, he made it clear that he would hold the department accountable if promises weren't kept. Back at home, Lisa worked tirelessly to rally support for their cause. She reached out to local activists, civil rights organizations, and even reporters who specialized in social justice stories. One journalist, a kind woman named Andrea, agreed to write an article about Marcus's experience. When it was published online, it quickly gained traction, sparking discussions across the city. Community leaders invited the Johnsons to speak at town hall meetings and rallies. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to share his story publicly. But Elijah and Lisa encouraged him to use his voice. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," Lisa assured him. "But remember, your story has power. It can inspire others to stand up too." With his parents' support, Marcus decided to participate in a youth-led rally scheduled for the following weekend. As he prepared his speech, he poured his heart into every word, determined to turn his pain into purpose. Little did he know, this decision would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire community. The day of the youth-led rally arrived, and the park where Marcus had been stopped by the officers was transformed. What was once a quiet space now buzzed with energy as families, students, Activists and community leaders gathered under bright banners that read "Justice for All" and "Our Voices Matter." The air was filled with chatter, laughter, and occasional chants, led by young organizers holding megaphones. For Marcus, stepping into this scene felt surreal. It was both empowering and overwhelming. Elijah and Lisa stood nearby, watching proudly as their son made his way to the small stage set up at the center of the park. Marcus clutched a folded piece of paper in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Despite his nerves, he couldn't help but feel inspired by the crowd around him. People of all ages and backgrounds had come together, united by a shared desire for change. Some held signs with messages like "End racial profiling" and "Protect our kids," while others simply listened intently, ready to hear what the speakers had to say. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, the noise gradually faded into silence. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he froze, overwhelmed by the sea of faces staring back at him. But then he caught sight of his parents standing near the front row. Elijah gave him an encouraging nod, and Lisa smiled warmly. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. "Hi, everyone," he started, his voice trembling slightly but clear enough to carry across the park. "My name is Marcus Johnson, and I'm here today because something happened to me that shouldn't happen to anyone, especially not a kid just trying to go to school." As he continued, his words grew steadier. He recounted the events of that morning in the park, describing how the officers questioned him, searched his belongings, and treated him as if he were guilty before giving him a chance to explain himself. His voice cracked when he talked about feeling powerless and humiliated, but he pushed through, knowing his story needed to be heard. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said, his tone firm now. "But even if I had, no one deserves to be treated the way I was treated that day. Not because of who they are or what they look like." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering loudly as Marcus paused to collect himself. Tears glistened in his eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of determination. He went on to talk about why he chose to share his experience publicly. "I want people to know that we can't stay silent when things aren't right. We have to stand up, for ourselves, for each other, and for the future." By the time Marcus finished speaking, the entire park was on its feet, clapping and chanting his name. Many in the audience wiped away tears, moved by his courage and honesty. Even some of the adults admitted later that they hadn't expected such wisdom and strength from someone so young. After the rally, several community leaders approached Elijah and Lisa, thanking them for allowing Marcus to share his story. One organizer handed Marcus a notebook, saying, "Keep writing, Marcus. Your words are powerful. They'll make people think, and maybe even act." That evening, as the family sat together at home, Marcus reflected on the day's events. Though he still carried the weight of what had happened, he also felt a newfound sense of purpose. Writing poetry had always been his way of processing emotions, but now he realized it could be more than that. It could be a tool for change. With his parents' encouragement, Marcus decided to start sharing his poems online, hoping to reach others who might feel unseen or unheard. Each poem became a thread connecting him to a growing network of supporters, proving that even the smallest voices could spark big movements. And as the weeks passed, Marcus began to see glimpses of progress, not just in his own life, but in the world around him. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Marcus's story continued to spread far beyond what anyone had expected. The police department followed through on its promises, implementing new training programs focused on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques. Officers were required to attend workshops led by community leaders and experts in social justice, learning how to approach situations with empathy and fairness. Elijah stayed involved. Attending meetings and ensuring accountability remained a priority. Slowly but surely, trust between the police and the community began to rebuild. For Marcus, life started to settle into a new rhythm. Though he still encountered moments of unease, like when strangers recognized him at the grocery store or teachers gave him lingering looks. He found strength in knowing that his voice had made an impact. His poems gained traction online, resonating with people across the country who shared similar experiences. One poem, titled "Walking While Black," went viral, sparking conversations about racial profiling and systemic inequality. It was even featured in a local art exhibit celebrating young voices for change. At school, Marcus became known not just as the boy who spoke out, but also as someone determined to make a difference. Classmates approached him more often now, asking questions or sharing their own stories. Some joined him in organizing after-school discussions about racism and privilege, creating a safe space for students to talk openly. Teachers noticed the shift too, praising Marcus for inspiring others to think critically about the world around them. The Johnson family grew closer through it all. Elijah and Lisa worked tirelessly alongside activists and city officials to push for broader reforms, while Marcus channeled his emotions into writing and advocacy. They attended rallies together, hosted community events at their home, and supported one another during tough days. Despite the challenges, they felt united by a shared mission: to create a better future for everyone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, the Johnsons gathered in their backyard. Elijah fired up the grill while Lisa set the table with plates of food. Marcus sat cross-legged on the grass, flipping through his notebook, adding finishing touches to a new poem. The air smelled of grilled burgers and blooming flowers, a comforting reminder of simpler times. "You know what," Elijah said as he flipped a burger, "we've come a long way since that morning in the park." Lisa nodded, smiling softly. "We have, but there's still work to do." Marcus looked up from his notebook, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, but I think we're making a difference. Even if it's small, it matters." Elijah walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've already made a big difference, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." As they ate dinner under the stars, laughter filled the air. For the first time in months, the weight of everything they'd been through seemed lighter. They weren't naive enough to believe the fight was over. There would always be obstacles ahead, but they faced them with hope and resilience. Later that night, as Marcus lay in bed, he opened his notebook one last time. He scribbled a few lines onto a fresh page, capturing the essence of what he'd learned over the past months. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward brings the dawn closer. Every voice adds light to the darkness, and every story plants seeds for tomorrow. Closing the notebook, Marcus smiled faintly. Tomorrow held uncertainty, but it also held promise. And for now, that was enough.